Chapter 17 of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. While Silas and Eppie were seated on the bank discoursing in the fleckered shade of the ash tree, Miss Priscilla Lammeter was resisting her sister's arguments that it would be better to take tea at the Red House and let her father have a long nap than drive home to the Warrens so soon after dinner. The family party, of four only, were seated round the table in the dark wainscoted parlour, with a Sunday dessert before them of fresh filberts, apples, and pears, duly ornamented with leaves by Nancy's own hand before the bells had rung for church. A great change has come over the dark wainscoted parlour since we saw it in Godfrey's bachelor days, and under the wifeless reign of the old squire. Now all is polish on which no yesterday's dust is ever allowed to rest, from the yard's width of oaken boards round the carpet to the old squire's guns and whips and walking sticks ranged on the stag's antlers above the mantelpiece. All other signs of sporting and outdoor occupation Nancy has removed to another room, but she has brought into the Red House the habit of filial reverence, and preserves sacredly in a place of honour these relics of her husband's departed father. The tankards are on the side table still, but the bossed silver is undimmed by handling, and there are no dregs to send forth unpleasant suggestions. The only prevailing scent is of the lavender and rose leaves that fill the vases of Derbyshire spar. All is purity and order in this once dreary room, for 15 years ago it was entered by a new presiding spirit. "Now, father," said Nancy, "is there any call for you to go home to tea? Mayn't you just as well stay with us, such a beautiful evening as it's likely to be?" The old gentleman had been talking with Godfrey about the increasing poor rate and the ruinous times, and had not heard the dialogue between his daughters. "My dear, you must ask Priscilla," he said in the once firm voice, now become rather broken. "She manages me and the farm too." "And reason good as I should manage you, father," said Priscilla, "else you'd be giving yourself your death with rheumatism. And as for the farm, if anything turns out wrong, as it can't but do in these times, there's nothing kills a man so soon as having nobody to find fault with but himself. It's a deal the best way of being master, to let somebody else do the ordering, and keep the blaming in your own hands. It'd save many a man a stroke, I believe." "Well, well, my dear," said her father, with a quiet laugh, "I didn't say you don't manage for everybody's good." "Then manage so as you may stay to tea, Priscilla," said Nancy, putting her hand on her sister's arm affectionately. "Come now, and we'll go round the garden while father has his nap." "My dear child, he'll have a beautiful nap in the gig, for I shall drive. And as for staying to tea, I can't hear of it, for there's this dairymaid, now she knows she's to be married turned Michaelmas, she'll as lief pour the new milk into the pig trough as into the pans. That's the way with them all. It's as if they thought the world 'ud be new made because they're to be married. So come and let me put my bonnet on, and there'll be time for us to walk round the garden while the horse is being put in." When the sisters were treading the neatly swept garden walks, between the bright turf that contrasted pleasantly with the dark cones and arches and wall-like hedges of yew, Priscilla said, "I'm as glad as anything at your husband making that exchange of land with cousin Osgood, and beginning the dairying. It's a thousand pities you didn't do it before, for it'll give you something to fill your mind. There's nothing like a dairy if folks want a bit of worrit to make the days pass. For as for rubbing furniture, when you can once see your face in a table, there's nothing else to look for. But there's always something fresh with a dairy, for even in the depths of winter there's some pleasure in conquering the butter, and making it come whether or no. My dear," added Priscilla, pressing her sister's hand affectionately as they walked side by side, "you'll never be low when you've got a dairy." "Ah, Priscilla," said Nancy, returning the pressure with a grateful glance of her clear eyes, "but it won't make up to Godfrey. A dairy's not so much to a man, and it's only what he cares for that ever makes me low. I'm contented with the blessings we have, if he can be contented." "It drives me past patience," said Priscilla impetuously, "that way of the men, always wanting and never easy with what they've got. They can't sit comfortable in their chairs when they've neither ache nor pain, but either they must stick a pipe in their mouths to make 'em better than well, or else they must be swallowing something strong, though they're forced to make haste before the next meal comes in. But joyful be it spoken, our father was never that sort of man. And if it had pleased God to make you ugly like me, so as the men wouldn't ha' run after you, We might ha' kept to our own family, and had nothing to do with folks as have got uneasy blood in their veins." "Oh, don't say so, Priscilla," said Nancy, repenting that she had called forth this outburst. "Nobody has any occasion to find fault with Godfrey. It's natural he should be disappointed at not having any children. Every man likes to have somebody to work for and lay by for, and he always counted on making a fuss of them when they were little. There's many another man 'ud hanker more than he does. He's the best of husbands." "Oh, I know," said Priscilla, smiling sarcastically. "I know the way of wives. They set one on to abuse their husbands, and then they turn round on one and praise 'em as if they wanted to sell 'em. But father'll be waiting for me. We must turn now." The large gig with the steady old grey was at the front door, and Mr. Lammeter was already on the stone steps, passing the time in recalling to Godfrey what very fine points Speckle had when his master used to ride him. "I always would have a good horse, you know," said the old gentleman, not liking that spirited time to be quite effaced from the memory of his juniors. "Mind you bring Nancy to the Warrens before the week's out, Mr. Cass," was Priscilla's parting injunction, as she took the reins and shook them gently, by way of friendly incitement to Speckle. "I shall just take a turn to the fields against the stone pits, Nancy, and look at the draining," said Godfrey. "You'll be in again by tea time, dear?" "Oh yes, I shall be back in an hour." It was Godfrey's custom on a Sunday afternoon to do a little contemplative farming in a leisurely walk. Nancy seldom accompanied him, for the women of her generation, unless, like Priscilla, they took to outdoor management, were not given to much walking beyond their own house and garden, finding sufficient exercise in domestic duties. So, when Priscilla was not with her, she usually sat with Manse Bible before her, and after following the text with her eyes for a little while, she would gradually permit them to wander as her thoughts had already insisted on wandering. But Nancy's Sunday thoughts were rarely quite out of keeping with the devout and reverential intention implied by the book spread open before her. She was not theologically instructed enough to discern very clearly the relation between the sacred documents of the past, which she opened without method, and her own obscure, simple life. But the spirit of rectitude and the sense of responsibility for the effect of her conduct on others, which were strong elements in Nancy's character, had made it a habit with her to scrutinize her past feelings and actions with self-questioning solicitude. Her mind not being courted by a great variety of subjects, she filled the vacant moments by living inwardly, again and again, through all her remembered experience, especially through the 15 years of her married time, in which her life and its significance had been doubled. She recalled the small details, the words, tones, and looks in the critical scenes which had opened a new epoch for her, by giving her a deeper insight into the relations and trials of life, or which had called on her for some little effort of forbearance, or of painful adherence to an imagined or real duty, asking herself continually whether she had been in any respect blamable. This excessive rumination and self-questioning is perhaps a morbid habit, inevitable to a mind of much moral sensibility when shut out from its due share of outward activity and of practical claims on its affections, inevitable to a noble-hearted, childless woman, when her lot is narrow. "I can do so little, have I done it all well?" is the perpetually recurring thought, and there are no voices calling her away from that soliloquy, no peremptory demands to divert energy from vain regret or superfluous scruple. There was one main thread of painful experience in Nancy's married life, and on it hung certain deeply felt scenes which were the oftenest revived in retrospect. The short dialogue with Priscilla in the garden had determined the current of retrospect in that frequent direction this particular Sunday afternoon. The first wandering of her thought from the text, which she still attempted dutifully to follow with her eyes and silent lips, was into an imaginary enlargement of the defence she had set up for her husband against Priscilla's implied blame. The vindication of the loved object is the best balm affection can find for its wounds. A man must have so much on his mind, is the belief by which a wife often supports a cheerful face, under rough answers and unfeeling words. And Nancy's deepest wounds had all come from the perception that the absence of children from their hearth was dwelt on in her husband's mind as a privation to which he could not reconcile himself. Yet sweet Nancy might have been expected to feel still more keenly the denial of a blessing to which she had looked forward with all the varied expectations and preparations, solemn and prettily trivial, which fill the mind of a loving woman when she expects to become a mother. Was there not a drawer filled with the neat work of her own hands, all unworn and untouched, just as she had arranged it there 14 years ago, just but for one little dress which had been made the burial dress? But under this immediate personal trial, Nancy was so firmly unmurmuring, that years ago she had suddenly renounced the habit of visiting this drawer, lest she should in this way be cherishing a longing for what was not given. Perhaps it was this very severity towards any indulgence of what she held to be sinful regret in herself that made her shrink from applying her own standards to her husband. It is very different. It is much worse for a man to be disappointed in that way. A woman can always be satisfied with devoting herself to her husband, but a man wants something that will make him look forward more, and sitting by the fire is so much duller to him than to a woman. And always, when Nancy reached this point in her meditations, trying with premeditated sympathy to see everything as Godfrey saw it, there came a renewal of self-questioning. Had she done everything in her power to lighten Godfrey's privation? Had she really been right in the resistance which had cost her so much pain 6 years ago, and again 4 years ago, the resistance to her husband's wish that they should adopt a child? Adoption was more remote from the ideas and habits of that time than of her own. Still, Nancy had her opinion on it. It was as necessary for her mind to have an opinion on all topics, not exclusively masculine, that had come under her notice, as for her to have a precisely marked place for every article of her personal property, and her opinions were always principles to be unwaveringly acted on. They were firm, not because of their basis, but because she held them with a tenacity inseparable from her mental action. On all the duties and proprieties of life, from filial behaviour to the arrangements of the evening toilet, pretty Nancy Lammeter, by the time she was 23, had her unalterable little code, and had formed every one of her habits in strict accordance with that code. She carried these decided judgments within her in the most unobtrusive way. They rooted themselves in her mind, and grew there as quietly as grass. Years ago, we know, she insisted on dressing like Priscilla, because it was right for sisters to dress alike, and because she would do what was right if she wore a gown dyed with cheese-colouring. That was a trivial but typical instance of the mode in which Nancy's life was regulated. It was one of those rigid principles, and no petty egoistic feeling, which had been the ground of Nancy's difficult resistance to her husband's wish. To adopt a child, because children of your own had been denied to you, was to try and choose your lot in spite of Providence. The adopted child, she was convinced, would never turn out well, and would be a curse to those who had wilfully and rebelliously sought what it was clear that, for some high reason, they were better without. When you saw a thing was not meant to be, said Nancy, it was a bounden duty to leave off so much as wishing for it. And so far, perhaps, the wisest of men could scarcely make more than a verbal improvement in her principle. But the conditions under which she held it apparent that a thing was not meant to be depended on a more peculiar mode of thinking. She would have given up making a purchase at a particular place if, on 3 successive times, rain or some other cause of heaven's sending had formed an obstacle, and she would have anticipated a broken limb or other heavy misfortune to any one who persisted in spite of such indications. "But why should you think the child would turn out ill?" said Godfrey in his remonstrances. "She has thriven as well as child can do with the weaver, and he adopted her. There isn't such a pretty little girl anywhere else in the parish, or one fitter for the station we could give her. Where can be the likelihood of her being a curse to anybody?" "Yes, my dear Godfrey," said Nancy, who was sitting with her hands tightly clasped together, and with yearning, regretful affection in her eyes. "The child may not turn out ill to the weaver, but then he did not go to seek her, as we should be doing. It will be wrong, I feel sure it will. Don't you remember what that lady we met at the Royston Baths told us about the child her sister adopted? That was the only adopting I ever heard of, and the child was transported when it was 23. Dear Godfrey, don't ask me to do what I know is wrong. I should never be happy again. I know it is very hard for you. It's easier for me, but it's the will of Providence." It might seem singular that Nancy, with her religious theory pieced together out of narrow social traditions, fragments of church doctrine imperfectly understood, and girlish reasonings on her small experience, should have arrived by herself at a way of thinking so nearly akin to that of many devout people, whose beliefs are held in the shape of a system quite remote from her knowledge. Singular, if we did not know that human beliefs, like all other natural growths, elude the barriers of system. Godfrey had from the first specified Eppie, then about 12 years old, as a child suitable for them to adopt. It had never occurred to him that Silas would rather part with his life than with Eppie. Surely the weaver would wish the best to the child he had taken so much trouble with, and would be glad that such good fortune should happen to her. She would always be very grateful to him, and he would be well provided for to the end of his life, provided for as the excellent part he had done by the child deserved. Was it not an appropriate thing for people in a higher station to take a charge off the hands of a man in a lower? It seemed an eminently appropriate thing to Godfrey, for reasons that are known only to himself. And by a common fallacy he imagined the measure would be easy because he had private motives for desiring it. This was rather a coarse mode of estimating Silas's relation to Eppie, but we must remember that many of the impressions which Godfrey was likely to gather concerning the labouring people around him would favour the idea that deep affections can hardly go along with callous palms and scant means, and he had not had the opportunity, even if he had had the power, of entering immediately into all that was exceptional in the weaver's experience. It was only the want of adequate knowledge that could have made it possible for Godfrey deliberately to entertain an unfeeling project. His natural kindness had outlived the blighting time of cruel wishes, and Nancy's praise of him as a husband was not founded entirely on a wilful illusion. "I was right," she said to herself, when she had recalled all their scenes of discussion. "I feel I was right to say him nay, though it hurt me more than anything. But how good Godfrey has been about it! Many men would have been very angry with me for standing out against their wishes, and they might have thrown out that it had ill luck in marrying me. But Godfrey has never been the man to say an unkind word. It's only what he can't hide. Everything seems so blank to him, I know, and the land, what a difference it'd make to him, when he goes to see after things, if he'd children growing up that he was doing it all for. But I won't murmur, and perhaps if he'd married a woman who'd have had children, she'd have vexed him in some other ways." This possibility was Nancy's chief comfort, and to give it greater strength she laboured to make it impossible that any other wife should have had more perfect tenderness. She had been forced to vex him by that one denial. Godfrey was not insensible to her loving effort, and did Nancy no injustice as to the motives of her obstinacy. It was impossible to have lived with her 15 years and not be aware that an unselfish clinging to the right, and a sincerity clear as the flower-born dew, were her main characteristics. Indeed, Godfrey felt this so strongly that his own more wavering nature, too averse to facing difficulty to be unvaryingly simple and truthful, was kept in a certain awe of this gentle wife who watched his looks with a yearning to obey them. It seemed to him impossible that he should ever confess to her the truth about Eppie. She would never recover from the repulsion the story of his earlier marriage would create, told to her now after that long concealment. And the child, too, he thought, must become an object of repulsion. The very sight of her would be painful. The shock to Nancy's mingled pride and ignorance of the world's evil might even be too much for her delicate frame. Since he had married her with that secret in his heart, he must keep it there to the last. Whatever else he did, he could not make an irreparable breach between himself and his long-loved wife. Meanwhile, why could he not make up his mind to the absence of children from a hearth brightened by such a wife? Why did his mind fly uneasily to that void, as if it were the sole reason why life was not thoroughly joyous to him? I suppose it is the way with all men and women who reach middle age without the clear perception that life never can be thoroughly joyous. Under the vague dullness of the grey hours, dissatisfaction seeks a definite object, and finds it in the privation of an untried good. Dissatisfaction, seated musingly on a childless hearth, thinks with envy of the father whose return is greeted by young voices, seated at the meal where their little heads rise one above the other, like nursery plants. It sees a black care hovering behind every one of them, and thinks the impulses by which men abandon freedom and seek for ties are surely nothing but brief madness. In Godfrey's case there were further reasons why his thoughts should be continually solicited by this one point in his lot. His conscience, never thoroughly easy about Eppie, now gave his childless home the aspect of a retribution, and as the time passed on under Nancy's refusal to adopt her, any retrieval of his error became more and more difficult. On this Sunday afternoon it was already 4 years since there had been any allusion to the subject between them, and Nancy supposed it was for ever buried. "I wonder if he'll mind it less or more as he gets older," she thought. "I'm afraid more. Aged people feel the miss of children. What would father do without Priscilla? And if I die, Godfrey will be very lonely, not holding together with his brothers much. But I won't be over anxious and trying to make things out beforehand. I must do my best for the present." With that last thought Nancy roused herself from her reverie, and turned her eyes again towards the forsaken page. It had been forsaken longer than she imagined, for she was presently surprised by the appearance of the servant with the tea things. It was, in fact, a little before the usual tea time, but Jane had her reasons. "Is your master come into the yard, Jane?" "No, ma'am, he isn't," said Jane, with a slight emphasis, of which, however, her mistress took no notice. "I don't know whether you've seen him, ma'am," continued Jane, after a pause, "but there's folks making haste all one way, afore the front window. I doubt something's happened. There's never a man to be seen in the yard, else I should send and see. I've been up to the top attic, but there's no seeing anything for trees. I hope nobody's hurt, that's all." "Oh no, I daresay there's nothing much the matter," said Nancy. "It's perhaps Mr. Snell's bull got out again, as he did before." "I wish he mayn't gore anybody then, that's all," said Jane, not altogether despising a hypothesis which covered a few imaginary calamities. "That girl's always terrifying me," thought Nancy. "I wish Godfrey would come in." She went to the front window, and looked as far as she could see along the road, with an uneasiness which she felt to be childish, for there were now no such signs of excitement as Jane had spoken of, and Godfrey would not be likely to return by the village road, but by the fields. She continued to stand, however, looking at the placid churchyard, with the long shadows of the gravestones across the bright green hillocks, and at the glowing autumn colours of the rectory trees beyond. Before such calm external beauty the presence of a vague fear is more distinctly felt, like a raven flapping its slow wing across the sunny air. Nancy wished more and more that Godfrey would come in. End of chapter 17. Of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Someone opened the door at the other end of the room, and Nancy felt that it was her husband. She turned from the window with gladness in her eyes, for the wife's chief dread was stilled. "Dear, I'm so thankful you're come," she said, going towards him. "I began to get—" She paused abruptly, for Godfrey was laying down his hat with trembling hands, and turned towards her with a pale face and a strange unanswering glance, as if he saw her indeed, but saw her as part of a scene invisible to herself. She laid her hand on his arm, not daring to speak again, but he left the touch unnoticed, and threw himself into his chair. Jane was already at the door with a hissing urn. "Tell her to keep away, will you?" said Godfrey. And when the door was closed again, he exerted himself to speak more distinctly. "Sit down, Nancy. There," he said, pointing to a chair opposite him. "I came back as soon as I could, to hinder anybody's telling you but me. I've had a great shock, but I care most about the shock it'll be to you." "It isn't father and Priscilla?" said Nancy, with quivering lips, clasping her hands together tightly on her lap. "No, it's nobody living," said Godfrey, unequal to the considerate skill with which he would have wished to make his revelation. "It's Dunstan, my brother Dunstan, that we lost sight of 16 years ago. We found his body, his skeleton." The deep dread Godfrey's look had created in Nancy made her feel these words a relief. She sat in comparative calmness to hear what else he had to tell. He went on. The stone pit has gone dry suddenly from the draining, I suppose, and there he lies, has lain for 16 years, wedged between two great stones. There's his watch and seals, and there's my gold-handled hunting whip, with my name on. He took it away without my knowing the day he went hunting on Wildfire, the last time he was seen." Godfrey paused. It was not so easy to say what came next. "Do you think he drowned himself?" said Nancy, almost wondering that her husband should be so deeply shaken by what had happened all those years ago to an unloved brother, of whom worse things had been augured. "No, he fell in," said Godfrey in a low but distinct voice, as if he felt some deep meaning in the fact. Presently he added, "Dunstan was the man that robbed Silas Marner." The blood rushed to Nancy's face and neck at this surprise and shame, for she had been bred up to regard even a distant kinship with crime as a dishonour. "Oh, Godfrey," she said, with compassion in her tone, for she had immediately reflected that the dishonour must be felt still more keenly by her husband. "There was the money in the pit," he continued, "all the weaver's money. Everything's been gathered up, and they're taking the skeleton to the Rainbow. But I came back to tell you. There was no hindering it, you must know." He was silent, looking on the ground for 2 long minutes. Nancy would have said some words of comfort under this disgrace, but she refrained, from an instinctive sense that there was something behind, that Godfrey had something else to tell her. Presently he lifted his eyes to her face and kept them fixed on her as he said, "Everything comes to light, Nancy, sooner or later. When God Almighty wills it, our secrets are found out. I've lived with a secret on my mind, but I'll keep it from you no longer. I wouldn't have you know it by somebody else, and not by me. I wouldn't have you find it out after I'm dead. I'll tell you now. It's been I will and I won't with me all my life. I'll make sure of myself now." Nancy's utmost dread had returned. The eyes of the husband and wife met with awe in them, as at a crisis which suspended affection. "Nancy," said Godfrey slowly, "when I married you I hid something from you, something I ought to have told you. That woman Marner found dead in the snow, Eppie's mother, that wretched woman, was my wife. Eppie's my child." He paused, dreading the effect of his confession, but Nancy sat quite still, only that her eyes dropped and ceased to meet his. She was pale and quiet as a meditative statue, clasping her hands on her lap. "You'll never think the same of me again," said Godfrey after a little while, with some tremor in his voice. She was silent. "I oughtn't to have left the child unowned. I oughtn't to have kept it from you. But I couldn't bear to give you up, Nancy. I was led away into marrying her, and I suffered for it." Still Nancy was silent, looking down, and he almost expected that she would presently get up and say she would go to her father's. How could she have any mercy for faults that must seem so black to her, with her simple, severe notions? But at last she lifted up her eyes to his again and spoke. There was no indignation in her voice, only deep regret. "Godfrey, if you had but told me this 6 years ago, we could have done some of our duty by the child. Do you think I'd have refused to take her in if I'd known she was yours?" At that moment Godfrey felt all the bitterness of an error that was not simply futile, but had defeated its own end. He had not measured this wife with whom he had lived so long. She spoke again with more agitation. "And, oh, Godfrey, if we'd had her from the first, if you'd taken to her as you ought, she'd have loved me for her mother, and you'd have been happier with me. I could have better borne my little baby dying, and our life might have been more like we used to think it'd be." The tears fell, and Nancy ceased to speak. "But you wouldn't have married me then, Nancy, if I'd told you," said Godfrey, urged in the bitterness of his self-reproach to prove to himself that his conduct had not been utter folly. "You may think you would now, but you wouldn't then. With your pride and your father's, you'd have hated having anything to do with me after the talk there'd have been." "I can't say what I should have done about that, Godfrey. I should never have married anybody else. But I wasn't worth doing wrong for. Nothing is in this world. Nothing is so good as it seems beforehand. Not even our marrying wasn't, you see." There was a faint, sad smile on Nancy's face as she said the last words. "I'm a worse man than you'd thought I was, Nancy," said Godfrey, rather tremulously. "Can you forgive me, ever? The wrong to me is but little, Godfrey. You've made it up to me. You've been good to me for 15 years. It's another you did the wrong to, and I doubt it can ever all be made up for." "But we can take Eppie now," said Godfrey. "I wouldn't mind the world knowing at last. I'll be plain and open for the rest of my life." "It'll be different coming to us now she's grown up," said Nancy, shaking her head sadly. "But it's your duty to acknowledge her and provide for her, and I'll do my part by her, and pray to God Almighty to make her love me. Then we'll go together to Silas Marner's this very night, as soon as everything's quiet at the Stone Pits." End of chapter 18. Of Silas Marner by George Eliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening, Eppie and Silas were seated alone in the cottage. After the great excitement the weaver had undergone from the events of the afternoon, he had felt a longing for this quietude, and had even begged Mrs. Winthrop and Aaron, who naturally lingered behind every one else, to leave him alone with his child. The excitement had not passed away. It had only reached that stage when the keenness of the susceptibility makes external stimulus intolerable, when there is no sense of weariness, but rather an intensity of inward life, under which sleep is an impossibility. Anyone who has watched such moments in other men remembers the brightness of the eyes and the strange definiteness that comes over coarse features from that transient influence. It is as if a new fineness of ear for all spiritual voices has sent wonder-working vibrations through the heavy mortal frame, as if beauty born of murmuring sound had passed into the face of the listener. Silas's face showed that sort of transfiguration as he sat in his arm-chair and looked at Eppie. She had drawn her own chair towards his knees and leaned forward, holding both his hands while she looked up at him. On the table near them, lit by a candle, lay the recovered gold. The long-loved gold, ranged in orderly heaps, as Silas used to range it in the days when it was his only joy. He had been telling her how he used to count it every night, and how his soul was utterly desolate till she was sent to him. "At first, I'd a sort of feeling come across me now and then," he was saying in a subdued tone, "as if you might be changed into the gold again, for sometimes, turn my head which way I would, I seemed to see the gold. And I thought I should be glad if I could feel it and find it was come back, but that didn't last long. After a bit I should have thought it was a curse come again if it had drove you from me, for I'd got to feel the need o' your looks and your voice and the touch of your little fingers. You didn't know then, Eppie, when you were such a little un, you didn't know what your old father Silas felt for you." "But I know now, father," said Eppie. "If it hadn't been for you they'd have taken me to the workhouse, and there'd have been nobody to love me." My precious child, the blessing was mine. If you hadn't been sent to save me, I should have gone to the grave in my misery. The money was taken away from me in time, and you see it's been kept till it was wanted for you. It's wonderful. Our life is wonderful." Silas sat in silence a few minutes, looking at the money. "It takes no hold of me now," he said ponderingly. "The money doesn't. I wonder if it ever could again. I doubt it might if I lost you, Eppie. I might come to think I was forsaken again, and lose the feeling that God was good to me." At that moment there was a knocking at the door, and Eppie was obliged to rise without answering Silas. Beautiful she looked, with the tenderness of gathering tears in her eyes, and a slight flush on her cheeks as she stepped to open the door. The flush deepened when she saw Mr. and Mrs. Godfrey Cass. She made her little rustic curtsy, and held the door wide for them to enter. "We're disturbing you very late, my dear," said Mrs. Cass, taking Eppie's hand, and looking in her face with an expression of anxious interest and admiration. Nancy herself was pale and tremulous. Eppie, after placing chairs for Mr. and Mrs. Cass, went to stand against Silas, opposite to them. "Well, Marner," said Godfrey, trying to speak with perfect firmness, "it's a great comfort to me to see you with your money again that you've been deprived of so many years. It was one of my family did you the wrong, the more grief to me, and I feel bound to make up to you for it in every way. Whatever I can do for you will be nothing but repaying a debt, even if I look no further than the robbery. But there are other things I'm shall be beholden to you for, Marner." Godfrey checked himself. It had been agreed between him and his wife that the subject of his fatherhood should be approached very carefully, and that, if possible, the disclosure should be reserved for the future, so that it might be made to Eppie gradually. Nancy had urged this because she felt strongly the painful light in which Eppie must inevitably see the relation between her father and mother. Silas, always ill at ease when he was being spoken to by betters, such as Mr. Cass—tall, powerful, florid men, seen chiefly on horseback—answered with some constraint. "Sir, I've a deal to thank you for already. As for the robbery, I count it no loss to me. And if I did, you couldn't help it. You aren't answerable for it. You may look at it in that way, Marner, but I never can, and I hope you'll let me act according to my own feeling of what's just. I know you're easily contented. You've been a hard-working man all your life." "Yes, sir, yes," said Marner meditatively. "I should have been bad off without my work. It was what I held by when everything else was gone from me." "Ah," said Godfrey, applying Marner's words simply to his bodily wants, "it was a good trade to you in this country, because there's been a great deal of linen weaving to be done. But you're getting rather past such close work, Marner. It's time you laid by and had some rest. You look a good deal pulled down, though you're not an old man, are you?" "55, as near as I can say, sir," said Silas. "Oh, why, you may live 30 years longer. Look at old Macey. And that money on the table, after all, is but little. It won't go far either way, whether it's put out to interest, or you were to live on it as long as it would last. It wouldn't go far if you'd nobody to keep but yourself, and you've had two to keep for a good many years now." "Nay, sir," said Silas, unaffected by anything Godfrey was saying, "I'm in no fear o' want. We shall do very well. Eppie and me'll do well enough. There's few working folks have got so much laid by as that. I don't know what it is to gentlefolks, but I look upon it as a deal, almost too much. And as for us, it's little we want." "Only the garden, father," said Eppie, blushing up to the ears the moment after. "You love a garden, do you, my dear?" said Nancy, thinking that this turn in the point of view might help her husband. "We should agree in that. I give a deal of time to the garden." "Ah, there's plenty of gardening at the Red House," said Godfrey, surprised at the difficulty he found in approaching a proposition which had seemed so easy to him in the distance. "You've done a good part by Eppie, Marner, for 16 years. It'd be a great comfort to you to see her well provided for, wouldn't it? She looks blooming and healthy, but not fit for any hardships. She doesn't look like a strapping girl come of working parents. You'd like to see her taken care of by those who can leave her well off, and make a lady of her. She's more fit for it than for a rough life, such as she might come to have in a few years' time." A slight flush came over Marner's face, and disappeared like a passing gleam. Eppie was simply wondering Mr. Cass should talk so about things that seemed to have nothing to do with reality, but Silas was hurt and uneasy. "I don't take your meaning, sir," he answered, not having words at command to express the mingled feelings with which he had heard Mr. Cass's words. "Well, my meaning is this, Marner," said Godfrey, determined to come to the point. "Mrs. Cass and I, you know, have no children, nobody to benefit by our good home and everything else we have, more than enough for ourselves. And we should like to have somebody in the place of a daughter to us. We should like to have Eppie, and treat her in every way as our own child, and it'd be a great comfort to you in your old age, I hope, to see her fortune made in that way, after you've been at the trouble of bringing her up so well. And it's right you should have every reward for that. And Eppie, I'm sure, will always love you and be grateful to you. She'd come and see you very often, and we should be all on the look-out to do everything we could towards making you comfortable." A plain man like Godfrey Cass, speaking under some embarrassment, necessarily blunders on words that are coarser than his intentions, and that are likely to fall gratingly on susceptible feelings. While he had been speaking, Eppie had quietly passed her arm behind Silas's head, and let her hand rest against it caressingly. She felt him trembling violently. He was silent for some moments when Mr. Cass had ended, powerless under the conflict of emotions all alike painful. Eppie's heart was swelling at the sense that her father was in distress, and she was just going to lean down and speak to him when one struggling dread at last gained the mastery over every other in Silas, and he said faintly, "Eppie, my child, speak. I won't stand in your way. Thank Mr. and Mrs. Cass." Eppie took her hand from her father's head, and came forward a step. Her cheeks were flushed, but not with shyness this time. The sense that her father was in doubt and suffering banished that sort of self-consciousness. She dropped a low curtsy, first to Mrs. Cass and then to Mr. Cass, and said, "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. But I can't leave my father, nor own anybody nearer than him, and I don't want to be a lady, thank you, all the same." Here Eppie dropped another curtsy. "I couldn't give up the folks I've been used to." Eppie's lips began to tremble a little at the last words. She retreated to her father's chair again, and held him round the neck, while Silas, with a subdued sob, put up his hand to grasp hers. The tears were in Nancy's eyes, but her sympathy with Eppie was, naturally, divided with distress on her husband's account. She dared not speak, wondering what was going on in her husband's mind. Godfrey felt an irritation inevitable to almost all of us when we encounter an unexpected obstacle. He had been full of his own penitence and resolution to retrieve his error as far as the time was left to him. He was possessed with all-important feelings that were to lead to a predetermined course of action which he had fixed on as the right, and he was not prepared to enter with lively appreciation into other people's feelings counteracting his virtuous resolves. The agitation with which he spoke again was not quite unmixed with anger. "But I've a claim on you, Eppie, the strongest of all claims. It's my duty, Marner, to own Eppie as my child, and provide for her. She is my own child. Her mother was my wife. I've a natural claim on her that must stand before every other." Eppie had given a violent start and turned quite pale. Silas, on the contrary, who had been relieved by Eppie's answer, from the dread lest his mind should be in opposition to hers, felt the spirit of resistance in him set free, not without a touch of parental fierceness. "Then, sir," he answered, with an accent of bitterness that had been silent in him since the memorable day when his youthful hope had perished, "then, sir, why didn't you say so 16 years ago, and claim her before I'd come to love her, instead of coming to take her from me now, when you might as well take the heart out of my body? God gave her to me because you turned your back upon her, and he looks upon her as mine. You've no right to her. When a man turns a blessing from his door, it falls to them as take it in. I know that, Marner. I was wrong, and I've repented of my conduct in that matter," said Godfrey, who could not help feeling the edge of Silas's words. "I'm glad to hear it, sir," said Marner, with gathering excitement. "But repentance won't alter what's been going on for 16 years. And your coming now and saying I'm her father doesn't alter the feelings inside us. It's me she's been calling her father ever since she could say the word." "But I think you might look at the thing more reasonably, Marner," said Godfrey, unexpectedly awed by the weaver's direct truth-speaking. "It isn't as if she was to be taken quite away from you, so that you'd never see her again. She'll be very near you, and come to see you very often. She'll feel just the same towards you." "Just the same?" said Marner, more bitterly than ever. "How'll she feel just the same for me as she does now, when we eat of the same bit and drink of the same cup, and think of the same things from one day's end to the other? Just the same? That's idle talk. You'd cut us in two." Godfrey, unqualified by experience to discern the pregnancy of Marner's simple words, felt rather angry again. It seemed to him that the weaver was very selfish, a judgment readily passed by those who have never tested their own power of sacrifice, to oppose what was undoubtedly for Eppie's welfare, and he felt himself called upon, for her sake, to assert his authority. "I should have thought, Marner," he said severely, "I should have thought your affection for Eppie would make you rejoice in what was for her good, even if it did call upon you to give up something. You ought to remember your own life's uncertain, and she's at an age now when her lot may soon be fixed in a very different way from what it would be in her father's home. She may marry some low-working man, and then, whatever I might do for her, I couldn't make her well off. You're putting yourself in the way of her welfare, and though I'm sorry to hurt you after what you've done, and what I've left undone, I feel now it's my duty to insist on taking care of my own daughter. I want to do my duty." It would be difficult to say whether it was Silas or Eppie that was more deeply stirred by this last speech of Godfrey's. Thought had been very busy in Eppie as she listened to the contest between her old long-loved father and this new unfamiliar father, who had suddenly come to fill the place of that black featureless shadow which had held the ring and placed it on her mother's finger. Her imagination had darted backward in conjectures and forward in previsions of what this revealed fatherhood implied, and there were words in Godfrey's last speech which helped to make the previsions especially definite. Not that these thoughts, either of past or future, determined her resolution. That was determined by the feelings which vibrated into every word Silas had uttered. But they raised, even apart from these feelings, a repulsion towards the offered lot and the newly revealed father. Silas, on the other hand, was again stricken in conscience, and alarmed lest Godfrey's accusation should be true, lest he should be raising his own will as an obstacle to Eppie's good. For many moments he was mute, struggling for the self-conquest necessary to the uttering of the difficult words. They came out tremulously. "I'll say no more. Let it be as you will. Speak to the child. I'll hinder nothing." Even Nancy, with all the acute sensibility of her own affections, shared her husband's view that Marner was not justifiable in his wish to retain Eppie, after her real father had avowed himself. She felt that it was a very hard trial for the poor weaver, but her code allowed no question that a father by blood must have a claim above that of any foster father. Besides, Nancy, used all her life to plenteous circumstances and the privileges of respectability, could not enter into the pleasures which early nurture and habit connect with all the little aims and efforts of the poor who are born poor. To her mind, Eppie, in being restored to her birthright, was entering on a too long withheld but unquestionable good. Hence she heard Silas's last words with relief, and thought, as Godfrey did, that their wish was achieved. "Eppie, my dear," said Godfrey, looking at his daughter, not without some embarrassment, under the sense that she was old enough to judge him, "it'll always be our wish that you should show your love and gratitude to one who's been a father to you so many years, and we shall want to help you to make him comfortable in every way. But we hope you'll come to love us as well, and though I haven't been what a father should have been to you all these years, I wish to do the utmost in my power for you for the rest of my life, and provide for you as my only child. And you'll have the best of mothers in my wife. That'll be a blessing you haven't known since you were old enough to know it." "My dear, you'll be a treasure to me," said Nancy in her gentle voice. "We shall want for nothing when we have our daughter." Eppie did not come forward and curtsy as she had done before. She held Silas's hand in hers, and grasped it firmly. It was a weaver's hand, with a palm and finger-tips that were sensitive to such pressure, while she spoke with colder decision than before. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for your offers. They're very great, and far above my wish. For I should have no delight in life any more if I was forced to go away from my father, and knew he was sitting at home a-thinking of me and feeling known. We've been used to be happy together every day, and I can't think of no happiness without him. And he says he'd nobody in the world till I was sent to him, and he'd have nothing when I was gone, and he's took care of me and loved me from the first, and I'll cleave to him as long as he lives, and nobody shall ever come between him and me." "But you must make sure, Eppie," said Silas in a low voice, "you must make sure as you won't ever be sorry, because you've made your choice to stay among poor folks, and with poor clothes and things, when you might ha' had everything of the best." His sensitiveness on this point had increased as he listened to Eppie's words of faithful affection. "I can never be sorry, father," said Eppie. "I shouldn't know what to think on or to wish for, with fine things about me, as I haven't been used to. And it 'ud be poor work for me to put on things, and ride in a gig, and sit in a place at church, as 'ud make them as I'm fond of think me unfitting company for them. What could I care for then?" Nancy looked at Godfrey with a pained, questioning glance, but his eyes were fixed on the floor, where he was moving the end of his stick, as if he were pondering on something absently. She thought there was a word which might perhaps come better from her lips than from his. "What you say is natural, my dear child. It's natural you should cling to those who've brought you up," she said mildly. "But there's a duty you owe to your lawful father. There's perhaps something to be given up on more sides than one. When your father opens his home to you, I think it is right you shouldn't turn your back on it." "I can't feel as if I've got any father but one," said Eppie impetuously, while the tears gathered. "I've always thought of a little home where he'd sit i' the corner, and I should fend and do everything for him. I can't think of no other home. I wasn't brought up to be a lady, and I can't turn my mind to it. I like the working folks, and their victuals and their ways. And," she ended passionately while the tears fell, "I'm promised to marry a working man, as'll live with father, and help me to take care of him." Godfrey looked up at Nancy with a flushed face and smarting, dilated eyes. This frustration of a purpose towards which he had set out under the exalted consciousness that he was about to compensate, in some degree, for the greatest demerit of his life, made him feel the air of the room stifling. "Let us go," he said, in an undertone. "We won't talk of this any longer now," said Nancy, rising. "We're your well-wishers, my dear, and yours too, Marner. We shall come and see you again. It's getting late now." In this way she covered her husband's abrupt departure, for Godfrey had gone straight to the door, unable to say more. Chapter 19